Welcome back to the last panel of this first full day of the Global Democracy Conference. My name is Schiumerini. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Notre and also a faculty fellow of the Kellogg Institute. It's wonderful to see you all here, so many friends, so many colleagues, and so many interesting conversations. I also want to thank the online audience for expanding our reach. I hope you ask questions as well. So the title of this panel is New Ideas Measuring the State of Democracy. Today we learned a lot about the state of democracy in the world, in comparative perspective in the US. We also learned a lot about specific challenges coming from fake news, the geopolitical context and how threatening or not it might be, and also about movements that threaten democracy across the world. The refreshing yet really important aspect of this conference is that we are bringing disciplinary perspectives beyond political science and traditional social science. We're learning from journalists, practitioners, and even from political scientists that dare to reach out more often than we typically do. That's a very refreshing aspect of this conference. Now, ultimately, for this conversation to be fruitful, we need to agree on what we mean when we use terms of art such as democracy, political regimes, autocracy. Right? This conceptual agreement is fundamental for us to communicate, and it's not always obvious that we agree on what we mean by democracy. So the purpose of this panel is to actually problematize this. What do we mean by when we talk about democracy, autocracy, democratic backsliding, political regimes? And of course, this naturally leads to questions about measurement. And to be sure, in this panel, we will hear a lot about technicalities. But ultimately, the goal of this panel is to talk about meaning. How can we agree when we agree about these things? Today, I heard very interesting ideas about how actually people often disagree on the meaning of democracy in Latin America and different regions, and that's part of the challenge for defending democracy, that we actually have some consensus. So we will first hear a presentation by Michael Coppedge on the conceptualization and measurement of democracy. Then Brigitte will talk about some exciting developments for measuring the causal impact of democracy promotion attempts, which also draws on work by Bidem, and Patrick will lastly talk about a new methodology for trying to measure subnational democracy using expert surveys. So we will first go with Michael, and I will do introductions before presentations one by one. Well, Michael Coppedge doesn't need introduction here. He's a professor of political science at the University of Notre, a faculty fellow of the Kellogg Institute. He has published important works on party systems and party organization and political regimes in Latin America, including a fantastic book on Venezuelan democracy. But of special importance for this panel, Michael is the world's foremost expert in the measurement of democracy, and there is no question about it, right? I mean, he's like, yeah, of course you would. Also, he's the champion of humbleness, which is an important property to have as well. But really, he has contributed a lot through social scientific knowledge to, discussing conceptualization, measurement, and also complicated issues about item response theory and how it applies to the measurement of democracy. But as you know, he's also exemplary in building the bridge between academia and public-facing social science by, leading Bidem, which is something that is by far the most successful effort at measuring and also making available data on how to measure democracy in a complex way, accessible yet not, dumbing it down too much. He has written recent books on the topic, one where Brigitte is a co-author, Varieties of Democracy, Measuring 2 Centuries of Political Change, and also with several co-authors, Why Democracies Develop and Decline. So his presentation will be Bidem's conception of democracy and their consequences. So.
Thank you, Luis, for a very generous introduction. And I do want to make it clear that Bidem has always been a collective enterprise. It's not just my project.
My opinion.
Okay, so modesty aside, Bidem data has become widely used by a lot of different places, and it's used sometimes in ways that have very have big consequences for policy, because it's been used by USAID, by the World Bank, by the United Nations, by, even by other projects that measure democracy. International IDEA, even Freedom House sometimes uses VDEM data for some purposes. So I think it's important to talk a little bit about some of the assumptions that went into constructing or planning this project and how it's implemented. There are a lot of decisions that went into it, probably several dozen decisions that are pretty key. Some of them that would be pretty technical, like how we select country experts and how the user interface was designed, and the technicalities of the measurement model, which I'm not going to go into today. But I'm going to talk about some other things that matter. So just a quick overview of the arguments. We developed a conceptual scheme for measuring democracy, which was probably the biggest challenge of the project, because democracy is a very contested concept. Articles have been written about that. But the particular choices that we made were all guided by the knowledge that we were trying to define a concept that could be measured. And so we made choices about conceptualization that were designed to facilitate measurement. And that had some consequences. In the course of doing that, we made a bunch of choices, some of which are contestable. In fact, I think they're probably all contestable. There would be other ways of doing things, and I'm going to defend some of the choices that we made. But the choices had consequences, and the conclusion I'm going to advance at the end of this talk is that specific concepts and measures that come from our project they tend to be more useful than very general measures, such as measures of democracy, or even electoral democracy, liberal democracy, et cetera. The more specific we are, probably the more useful the data is. So what does it mean to conceptualize for measurement? I think in measurement, generally the idea is to get a good fit between ideas and evidence, a good fit between the ways that we think about the world, the constructs we have in our brains, and the way that the world actually works. If there's a good fit between ideas and evidence, then you have a good measure. We started off with a conception of democracy called polyarchy, developed by Robert Dahl, and then we recognized some critiques of the idea of polyarchy, and decided we would measure those as well. And we proceeded by disaggregating the concept of democracy into some major components of those things, and then we disaggregated the components into subcomponents, and in many cases we went to sub-subcomponents, and in some cases sub-sub-subcomponents, et cetera. And the idea was to develop increasingly specific concepts that we're trying to measure, in the hopes that we would end up with a set of very specific concepts that would be easier to measure. That is, they would be less contested if we get very specific. Because if you put 10 people in a room and ask them, what do you mean by democracy? You're going to get a whole lot of different answers. But if you ask them, what do you mean to have an accurate voter registry? Then the range of choices is pretty limited. And then once we actually measured those specific concepts, we then reaggregated those measures into indices of increasingly general concepts, all the way up to electoral, liberal, participatory, deliberative, and egalitarian democracy. But we didn't go all the way to what came to be known within the project as big D democracy, just one thing that's democracy, because we just thought that's just going too far. There's too much distinction among those things. And also along the way, we did a lot of empirical analysis of what the data was telling us, and that informed some understanding of the dimensionality of the components of democracy, and that fed back into conceptualization. So it was a kind of an iterative process. Here's just an example of the disaggregation. You start off with democracy, and then subtypes of democracy, and then components and subcomponents and sub-subcomponents, et cetera. So that you end up here with, I think I counted 31 different items that go into measuring electoral democracy. So in the larger picture, what we're trying to do is square the circle of being both qualitative and quantitative. We're qualitative in the sense that we recognize multiple conceptions of democracy, and also that we break down complex concepts into much more specific concepts. And all of those are very qualitative decisions. We're quantitative because each one of those things we try to measure as on a continuum, as matters of degree that we can measure with numbers on scales. And along the way, we made a bunch of choices that on issues that confront anybody who has to measure any kind of concept. And a lot of these choices are contestable. So one is a big issue which has been discussed so much in the literature on measuring democracy, the categorical measure versus a continuous measure of democracy. And I don't know, over the years I've gotten kind of tired of some of this debate because I think some of it has become kind of silly in the sense that, if you define democracy as a regime type or a category, but then you measure it as a continuum, then the continuous measures will be treated as measurement error, like they're going to be differences. Differences that don't really matter. But if you start with a continuous concept of democracy and you measure it as categories, then that also gets treated as measurement error, as a lack of validity. So, pick one and do that. But I think the serious arguments about whether to measure in a continuous way and to conceptualize in a continuous way or a categorical way have to do with empirical relationships. Because, arguments that say that countries cluster into certain regime types, and the countries that are members of that regime type are all pretty homogeneous, and they're also pretty distinct from countries that are in other clusters of different kinds of regime types. That's an empirical statement about a distribution in the world. Let's see. Or it might also be that there are discontinuities. This is kind of a different way of saying the same thing, that if you arrange countries on a single scale, there are discontinuities that separate countries into clumps or clusters. Or another kind of argument is that there are differences among political regimes that are differences of kind rather than differences of degree. That is, they're arrayed on different dimensions. And our data suggests that the answers to these three things are no, no, and yes. That is, countries are not very clumped. And also there are different dimensions to some degree. There are different dimensions of democracy that need to be measured on different continua. But really, I think, and this is probably the bottom line argument about our choice of measuring types about measuring continua rather than types, is that the only way you can test these arguments, the only way you can know which is the best way to proceed, is to measure things continually so that you can do the empirical analysis to find out whether there's clumping there or not. And here's just an instance. These are our continuous, the distribution of continuous values on all of on the civil liberties variables that go into our measure. And they're a little bit lumpy, but they're not clear clusters of country years along those dimensions. They're distributed in almost in a normal way. A second kind of choice that we made had to do with what varieties of democracy to measure. And we ended up measuring electoral, liberal, participatory, egalitarian, and deliberative kinds of democracy, but those do not exhaust all the possibilities. There are other kinds of democracy people could be thinking about. Maybe we should also measure something like communitarian democracy, or new kinds of participation or consultation, deliberation. We've heard a lot of ideas about deliberation today. Oversight of the executive, all kinds of things. Should we pay more attention to various forms of tutelage over elected authorities that might be exercised by the military or elites of other kinds? So maybe we haven't exhausted all the different aspects of democracy that could be measured. However, we decided not to measure Leiphardt's distinction between majoritarian and consensus democracy, and there's an empirical justification for that, and I feel good about that decision, even though that's something we intended to do originally. But we also decided to measure some concepts that are sort of on the periphery of the concept of democracy, things that are related to it but not exactly democracy, things like corruption, things like the rule of law, things like, well, we did decide, sovereignty is included there. So, there are choices that are made that affect what kind of data we make available. A third kind of question is how general or specific should our conceptions and measures be? And our choices were kind of dictated here by the ambition of the project. That is, we were trying to measure democracy in any and every country in the world, going back pretty far in world history. And that forced us to define, well, to frame our measures in terms of concepts that would travel anywhere and any time. And that caused us to overlook some important institutions and practices that might be important in some countries but just don't exist in other countries. Like, we don't have a measure of the Electoral College, which is really important for the United States, but it's now the only country in the world that has an Electoral College. So it's not efficient for us to ask a question about that where 99.9% of the time the answer is going to be no, this doesn't exist. So we don't ask about that. We also did some concept stretching here, like many of our elections questions. We ask about the electoral management body, which basically does not exist in the United States. Instead, we have a lot of county-level election authorities and the Secretary of State. But some countries do have an actual electoral management body that has a name and official role, and it's mentioned in the Constitution. We had to face limits of the scarcity of data that are imposed by they impose limits on how specific the indicators can be. And for that reason, we didn't attempt to measure democracy for subnational units, states, provinces, regions, municipalities, because we just thought first of all, there's not a homogeneous system of tiers of government from national to local. China has, I think, 7 different tiers from national to local. Russia has multiple ones, and they're not really equivalent to each other sometimes. But despite that, I'm now involved in a project to try to measure subnational democracy, and Brigitte is going to talk about that as well. So, I think we had a conference a year ago, okay, and people were saying, we need this, so I think we're working on it. And we also had to deepen our conceptualization in order to define these indicators. Can't see these things very well. Anyway, we had to define what it is that changes as you move from the most positive pole to the most negative pole on each one of these continua. And theory didn't necessarily tell us how to do that or what choices to make, and there are often many choices. What is it that changes as you go from the best situation to the worst one? We had to define that. And probably the most contestable choice is the formula for constructing multidimensional indices. Like, you have some things that, if they're perfectly correlated, it doesn't matter how you combine them. But if they're not perfectly correlated, then the formula for combining these different measures can make a big difference. We ended up with something that's a combination of an additive formula and a multiplicative formula, and it leads to things like this. So this is like an egalitarian component on this axis and a polyarchy or electoral democracy measure on that axis, and then the vertical axis is a measure of egalitarian democracy. And so you see, some countries can score really high only if they're high on both polyarchy and egalitarian component. If they're low on both, they're down in this corner. But there are places like Cuba, the score is actually pretty high on the egalitarian component, or at least used to, but very low on polyarchy, and so it ends up in a fairly low place. These choices have consequences. Because all of our high-level indices contain the electoral democracy index, they're very highly correlated with each other. If you disaggregate and go to less specific measures, there's much less of an association among our indicators. And if you go down to specific items, these look at different variables for 6 different countries, and you can see they don't always move together. They're not perfectly correlated at that very specific level. And in fact, you lose a lot of variance when you aggregate specific measures up to high-level things like electoral democracy. And this is the basic reason why it's, I say, don't measure a concept as general as democracy unless you really have to. Because you could get much more useful information about a larger number of specific indicators. Now, I don't know, was your time limit based on 12 minutes or 15?
Sorry? Based on 15, but it's fine.
Oh, I've been asked to talk about this, so I'm going over time a little bit. So there have been some people who have been critical of VDEM and other measures that rely on expert ratings to measure democracy. They've been saying that democracy is probably not in decline anymore, and produce some so-called objective indicators that have not been declining in recent years. And they say, why is this? And they say it might be that there's a kind of bad vibe bias that affects subjective coders. So that if they become convinced that democracy is in decline around the world, then their ratings of countries also show declines. And I would say it's true that some reports, including often our democracy report, have exaggerated the backsliding that's happened in the world. First off, past trends are not predictions of future performance. These are not predictions, these are just ratings of what's happened in the past, so we can't say these countries are trending down and implying that that's going to continue. It's not that at all. I would also say that global averages are not very meaningful. In every year, some countries improve and some countries decline, and the vast majority do not change. So I'd rather not talk about global averages. I'd rather talk about which countries are changing. And usually the number of backsliding countries is small. Here's a distribution. The 2 shades of blue are 1-year and 10-year changes. And it gives you the number of countries that improved. And the red ones down here are the number of countries that declined. The small area is change over 1 year, and the lighter area is change over 10 years. And so this kind of disagrees with the narrative. Well, I mean, this disagrees with the narrative. These are the changes, or let me see, the size of the average change in electoral democracy. And according to this, and this takes into account all of the measurement uncertainty that we know about in our measures. And according to this, yes, the average change is in the negative zone, but only since 2020. And it's actually a pretty small change, like on the order of minus 0.025 on a 0 to 1 scale. And before 2015, it was still in positive territory for quite a few years. Why is this different from what other people have said? It's because the so-called objective indicators that they have proposed they don't take into account the sneaky tactics that modern day autocrats use in order to appear democratic while undermining democracy, such as winning by a small margin, attacking the media and the courts rather than elections, and so on. Like, they're doing a lot of things like that. And if you pay attention to individual countries, we know that democracy declined in India, in Turkey, in Hungary, etc. There's really no question about that. And we have the ability to check for some aspects of a kind of a bad vibes bias creeping into our data, and we have studied that as well as we can and have not been able to find any evidence of that. Brigitte worked on that as well. And so basically, anyway, Basically, we don't find any evidence of any bad violence. And in fact, the people who are critiquing this don't produce evidence that really supports that. It's just speculation on their part. So I'd say democracy is a little bit in decline in some places, but we don't need to say it's a catastrophe at this point. So I'll stop there. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you, Michael. So our second presenter is Brigitte Seim. She joins us from UNC Chapel Hill, where she's an associate professor in the Department of Public Policy. She's also the Peter Thatcher Gard Scholar in Honors, adjunct associate professor of global studies, and adjunct associate professor of political science. But she is also heavily involved with VDEM, where she's the project manager of experiments for the varieties of democracy. Project she also co-authored this piece where you respond to the critique of the bad vibes bias and subjective indicators. Her research focuses on the political economy of global policy, particularly threats to democracy and democratic governance and accountability. She has a very strong research agenda on methodology, particularly applied to the measurement of democracy. And a distinctive feature of her research is that she partners with international organizations, NGOs, to try to do research that is public-facing and policy relevant. And today she will be talking a bit about that as well. Thank you.
See, someone already did it. Okay, thank you for having me here today. First, just an anecdote. I did my postdoc at VDEM, and my first task was to circulate a Excel file that was designed to poll the principal investigators and project managers about how they thought we should aggregate to our index of democracy. And so if you can imagine sending a file to people like Michael, and John Gehring, and Jan Terrell, and Staffan Lindberg, and then getting back just a bunch of formulas. That was my first task as a postdoc. And I think that alone earned me a spot in this room. It was real fun. Okay, today I am talking about one of the kind of practitioner academic partnerships that I'm involved with that Luis mentioned, and I think it will be great to get feedback. It's a relatively new project. We have not actually rolled out our surveys yet, and so I'm eager to hear what you think and how we can improve it. This will be a great phase to get that feedback. It's a pilot project. We hope this works and seems promising. And then our plan is to hopefully scale it up if it does. I think that this project is actually a great fit for this conference in a number of ways. I think it picks up on some of the threads we've already heard about today. First of all, the kind of focus on pragmatism and how we can actually intervene and affect kind of the state of democracy around the world, not just study it abstractly from afar, but really affect it. And then also how academics can provide thought leadership for practitioners, which I really liked how Dimitri, wherever you are, brought that up in his comments on the last panel. And it builds on something Michael talked about, which is that the VDEM data are being widely used. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of how that served the motivation of the project. I am faculty at UNC, but this is a project that's actually currently being run by the Digital Society Project, or 3 of the 4 of the principal investigators associated with that. That's something that Stephen talked about earlier today. Okay. So, the motivation for this. So there is something called the DEP Award, the Democratic Elections and Political Processes Award. For those of you who do not know about this, this is a 5-year funding mechanism from USAID to this consortium. And the consortium, in turn, is formed of NDI, IRI, and IFES, so big democracy support organizations. And then a series of technical partners, including VDEM through our policy-facing organization, DARCH, which I can talk more about. There are lots of acronyms involved in this project. That's the punchline. So there's a huge leader award to just administer this democracy support worldwide, about $30 million. And then there are all of these associate awards that go to the actual democracy support activities, so in specific countries. Currently, there are already $250 million of those active as part of this award. And they're projected to be another $50 million, kind of just on the table currently, somewhere in the works. And the total ceiling for this is 800 million over the course of the 5 years, okay? So this is a huge funding mechanism. I'm sure this surprises absolutely no one in the room. So a lot of people then who are involved with this wants to know what is the effect of the programming. So does this programming actually do anything for the state of democracy? And specifically, do they achieve their objectives? So as with many democracy support programs, there's a huge kind of learning framework laid out with a bunch of questions. And so they want to know if they achieved any of those. The gold standard for answering these questions would be a set of RCTs, kind of rigorous, randomized interventions in a series of contexts to understand the causal effect of those interventions. But as has already come up today, there's a bit of an accessibility issue with RCTs. They're often, first of all, limited in scope because not everything can be randomized. Second of all, they're very resource intensive, so they can be unattainable for a lot of individuals hoping to do evaluation in the Global South. And then they're highly context specific. It's hard to generalize them. So VDEM, groups like VDEM sometimes come in. You know, these donors, these aid organizations approach us and say, can you tell us if our programming is having an effect? Can you analyze our programming in light of VDEM data and tell us if you see any shifts in the VDEM indicators as a result of, or at least coinciding with this programming? But as Michael just talked about, that process can be easily perverted, where we're looking for these changes in kind of high-level democracy indices, and we're not able to pick up kind of the lower-level, very specific democracy indicators. And then also, it's just very hard to get the kind of granular data we need at the indicator level, or at the subnational level, or at the temporal level. Okay, so I was involved in kind of the first phase of looking at what we know about democracy support and whether democracy support affects VDEM data, and the answer was, like, we still really don't know. And I became very frustrated, and so we are now rolling out a pilot to try to come up with kind of a middle ground between RCTs and looking at VDEM data. And that's what we're working on now, and please don't tell me it's a terrible idea, because now it's taking over my life. Okay. All right, so what we're proposing to do is to gather data that would facilitate an exploratory analysis of outcomes. Again, this is not going to be causal. At least it's not going to be rigorously causal in the way that a set of RCTs would be. But what we're doing is conducting a causal chain monitoring pilot. We definitely need a better name, so feel free to rebrand us. But the idea here is that we're going to translate some learning questions, so things that the partners in SEPs want to know the causal relationship about, into a causal chain. So some kind of depth programming leads to something, which leads to something, which leads to something, okay? And then we're going to translate those causal chain steps, all of X, Y, and Z, into survey questions. These survey questions, you'll see some examples, but they're similar to the VDEM ones. And then we're going to activate the DEP network in participating countries and have them fill out a set of these surveys and identify a set of experts to do so. Now, one of the things that I've thought a lot about in this project is kind of how to define expertise. And here we're really looking for practitioner lived experience. So not only are we kind of shifting to a more bottom-up approach to measuring democracy, but we're hopefully shifting to a more bottom-up approach to kind of identifying experts and expertise. So we're looking at individuals who are involved in watchdog organizations, members of the media, of civil society, working for women's advocacy groups, et cetera. They will be the ones to hopefully, literally that's what I should be doing instead of giving this talk, is compiling the list of experts. But these are the individuals who will hopefully fill out our surveys. And then they will fill out brief surveys on a quarterly basis. So one of the big issues we run into is it's really hard to kind of have the temporal granularity necessary to understand if a program is implemented on day one, if it has any effect on relevant outcomes, because it's VDEM data and similar data projects collect data only annually. So this will be quarterly. And then, as with VDEM, and we can talk a lot more about this, we're going to then run the survey data through a Bayesian IRT measurement model, similar to VDEM's, to obtain the country region quarter estimates. This regional part I haven't talked about yet, but we're also looking at 2 regions for each country. So it's absolutely correct that it's very difficult to kind of come up with apples to apples definitions of subnational across places like Russia and Brazil. But we are settling right now for this pilot to look at kind of within the capital and then in the outskirts, outside of the capital, and look at how dynamics differ. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of these technical details, but I'm happy to talk about it. So we selected 3 learning agenda questions that come from different themes and places where we think we might know something about a theory of change, about that causal chain that links a kind of democracy support to some outcomes of that support. And then we've prioritized the questions that lend themselves to survey questions, basically. And I won't kind of read these aloud, but we have one that's about women's participation in CSOs, in civil society. We have one about cross-party coalition formation. And then we have one about safeguarding electoral management bodies and kind of running elections. Okay, then we translated these into causal chains. Again, I won't talk about all of these details. But in brief, we kind of went through a lot of program documents to understand what the anticipated effects were, kind of why the practitioners did those programs to begin with. Then we went to the academic literature to try to find out, kind of cast a wider net for what could be potential effects. Then we grouped these things in terms of whether they were occurring earlier in this causal chain or later in the causal chain. And then we put them on a nice little chart. And the kind of details of this are not important. This is tiny, tiny font for all of you, I think, especially for my co-presenters. But the general idea is that the things in light blue over here, Carolina blue, those are the things that are kind of the independent variables, the intervention variables. And then the dark blue items are things that will be on our expert survey, that are the intended outcomes of that light blue work. Okay. This is for the 3 different areas. And then we turned each of those items, each of those bullets on that chart into a survey question for a total of about 20 to 30 questions on 3 different surveys, so about 60 to 90 questions total. And they were designed to be specific, to maximize variation in responses over time and across countries. This was a little bit different from VDEM, which, as Michael said, is a little more conscious of kind of the latent trait that's being measured, of the conceptualization of this trait. This was really kind of a utilitarian approach to get data variation. And then we deliberately are replicating some of the VDEM indicators as a validation test. Okay. I won't talk about all of the details of these, but the first survey is just a program survey for program officers, where we'll get more data about the specific activities that they ran that could be affecting these outcomes in the last quarter. I don't know if you can read this, but an example question is, this quarter in country whatever, how many party officials and politicians benefited from DEP technical assistance focused on policy reform? So this was something that our counterparts in CEP said they do a lot of, and we want to know what the effect is of that. Then there are 3 substantive surveys, and they're all generally the same format, except for a slightly different focus of the questions. And we will do one for women's CSO participation. An example question is, in country X, what share of women regularly participate in civic engagement? In political parties in country X, how often do major political parties forge compromises with other parties to produce policies? And then for the election survey, to what extent does the EMB have the capacity to accurately register eligible voters? So these are kind of much more specific, kind of nitty-gritty questions than the ones that are on the VDEM survey, and very deliberately so, because we think these are the kinds of things that maybe actually would change as the result of democracy support programming. Okay, I will definitely definitely not have time to go over those. Okay, so the last piece of this is just how we sampled countries. So we're not rolling this pilot out in every single country. We selected a sample based on achieving balance across regions. We wanted kind of a middle level of democracy, so we used VDEM data, of course, to narrow the pool. We wanted low levels of conflict and low to medium levels of foreign aid. That one turned out to be pretty much impossible. Turns out that these aid organizations, they move together. So it was hard to find ones where USAID was working, but there wasn't a lot of other aid. And then we wanted a medium level of economic development. So a place where we thought kind of democracy support could take hold and affect change without worrying about, overcoming extreme poverty. This is the sample of countries. We eventually ended up with 30 countries. We'll be doing data collection for 8 quarters. And we'll be collecting data from, about 8 to 10 experts for each of those observations. Okay, so we don't know if this will work on like a lot of different levels. I hope this will show something promising. I hope this isn't a complete waste of time, but there are a lot of questions to be figured out. Currently, we are recruiting respondents via this decentralized network of SEPS partners. We're finalizing and translating the questionnaires. Yes, they will be translated. We are planning the measurement model. Questions for you. What are the most promising aspects of this idea? What are the many things we are not thinking of that should be on our radar? What are the likely pitfalls we're going to encounter either at this current stage or well down the line? And then how can we make this a more compelling proof of concept? Again, this is supposed to be a pilot of something that I hope becomes an option for people who want to measure kind of sub-national democracy, very specific nitty-gritty details of democracy for purposes of understanding how there's covariation between these kinds of indicators and democracy support worldwide. So how can we kind of make this promising? And then the data will be publicly available, as with all the other data projects we're talking about. So how can we make this more valuable for scholars for research? And that is it.
Thank you, Brigitte. Our last presenter, last but not least, is Patrick McQuestion, who is our own PhD student in the dual degree in Peace Studies and Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. He studies comparative politics and methods. He is currently researching democratization and sustainable rural development during the implementation of comprehensive peace agreements. Patrick has a lot of experience on the ground and also doing research here before his PhD on the peace accords in Colombia. Today he's going to present a paper with Michael Coppedge on trying to extend the VDEM methodology to measure democracy at the subnational level. I was a discussant for this paper a month ago. I'm impressed at all the changes they made, and it looks great.
Thank you, everybody. This is a wonderful opportunity to share some research that we've done in collaboration with Michael Coppedge and Matt Sisk, who's not here with us today, but he's from the Department of Applied in Computational Mathematics and Statistics. He's helping us with sort of the mapping dimensions of this project. So measuring subnational democracy and application using the case of Colombia in 2018. So just an overview, what we do is introduce a method to measure subnational democracy based on VDEM survey data. VDEM questions contain key variables that experts agree are relevant for subnational elections and civil liberties. We use observational data for these variables in one country, Colombia, and estimate the relevance using factor analysis, a data reduction technique. And then we weight these factors according to the levels of VDEM inter-expert agreement. The results can be interpreted as expected levels of subnational democracy based on theoretical knowledge and observational data. So observational data is often used in democracy studies, but below the subnational level, below the national level, as we've heard, this can get tricky. It's often scarce, Information is non-standardized, it's expensive to obtain at times, and only partially informative. So for example, the number of local newspapers partially captures the idea of freedom of information, but what about the size of audiences, the independence of journalists, or editorial autonomy? Expert data, on the other hand, can compensate for some of these limitations. So information is absorbed through multiple sources, reading, following the news, conversations, and personal experience. And experts are less likely to be deceived by insincere statements and to consider one attribute definitive when there are other attributes that render it irrelevant. Existing measures have yet to examine how comparative VDEM data could be interacted with subnational observational data, and that's sort of the motivation for this project. McMahon has looked at unevenness using VDEM data, which has really opened the door for a lot of comparative analysis, but she hasn't studied democracy within states. Other studies have relied heavily on observational data, for example, on electoral data, or on individual country measures, which are really detailed but hard to compare across contexts. So our measurement approach combines both expert and observational data. It's designed in a way that could be replicated in other contexts. We consider 4 questions from VDEM that are related to subnational democracy, starting with these 4. Areas where elections are less free and fair, areas where they are more free and fair, and areas where civil liberties are stronger, and areas where civil liberties are weaker. In the survey, experts are given 22 different criteria to choose from. Choose all that apply, so they're binary variables providing a range of generic concepts that can apply in different countries. Here's an image, it's hard to read, but you have a list of the 4 questions, followed by a list of all the choose all that apply variables. You'll see rural, urban, economic development. Experts are given the option yes or no to respond to these factors and how they relate to elections or civil liberties. So the data that is produced by this process has a lot of variables, but these ratings are, again, they're limited to binary options, and we don't know where or how experts are conceptualizing these topics. So rural could mean one thing to one person and a totally different thing to someone else, which makes it tricky to work with at the subnational level. All we have are these proportions of agreement among the experts. So in the scores, you'll see proportions from 0 to 1 for each of these factors and across these 4 different survey questions. To render it useful, to render this data useful, we undergo 3 stages: conceptualization, operationalization, and measurement. So generally speaking, we select indicators for each of these variables. Then we undertake a data reduction technique to reduce all the data that we've collected on these variables, and then weight it according to VDEM data. Here's just a diagram of how this measurement approach happens. It may be hard to read, but we begin with the 22 variables, and then we select indicators for each of those variables and turn to observational data and collect observational data within the country. Then we undertake a factor analysis to identify latent factors within the data and assess whether those factors have any relation to democracy, generally speaking. At the same time, we use the data from VDEM, which, again, we don't know how experts are conceptualizing these topics, but we use this data to inform the relative weight of the factors that we've identified in the factor analysis. This gives us a general estimate of weighted subnational democracy. So just generally speaking, these are the indicators that we use to conceptualize the variables. As you'll see, they're in some cases we group them together. So rural and urban are conceptualized using one indicator, the rurality index, and so forth. And you'll see the sources of the data. For those that are familiar with Colombian data, you can see that a lot of these are publicly created, publicly measured data, and widely available to anybody. So we drew from this. Some variables are more tricky to measure than others. So like civil unrest, the way that we conceptualize that in this study is looking at forced displacement, declarations of forced displacement, and declarations of confinements, for example. There are many other ways to conceptualize. This gives us a sort of initial assessment. After we collect the data, we run the factor analysis. Here we can identify the latent dimensions in the data. And to clarify, in this analysis, we omit the regional locations, which are these variables 6 through 9, north, south, east, west. We omit this data. It's dichotomous, so it messes with the factor analysis. We're still working on how to make these, how to adequately capture these factors in the factor analysis. And we also omit the variables related to foreign rule, which in this case we don't find to be particularly relevant, and the last variable that's none of the above. So in total, we are analyzing 13 of the 22 variables contained in the survey questions, using a total of 17 indicators. So here are the results of the factor analysis based on the data. I'm sorry, I should have clarified. This is Columbia 2018, so it's just one cross-section of these variables. As you can see, there are sort of four factors that we identified. The first one, I'm looking at factors that are higher than 0.5 in relevance. They tend to concentrate on indigenous populations, indigenous data, and ruling party support. The second factor concentrates on densely populated, wealthy, ethnically diverse urban areas with petty crime. The third one on poor areas distant from Bogota with less petty crime. And finally, areas with victims of violence and civil unrest. Here's how we can visualize this data. The factor analysis allows us to map each of these factors at the municipal level. The total invariance explained by these four factors is over 75%. The results suggest that the first two factors explain 50% of data variation. They also suggest substantively splits along rural and urban, poorer and richer, and areas dominated by indigenous and non-indigenous populations. So in democratic theoretical terms, these roughly align with modernization arguments that urban, wealthy, ethnically diverse areas are associated with higher levels of democracy. After this factor analysis, we turn to the VDEM data. So you'll see here in 2018 for Colombia, the different scores according to the experts for the year of 2018 in Colombia. Each of these four survey questions have a unique score for the variables. We take the absolute value of the less and weaker and more and stronger categories of these questions. So you'll see the calculation of the absolute values in these gray columns. And what we do with those absolute values is interact them with the observational data. This is the first image that we have of weighted average democracy, subnational democracy in Colombia. You'll see weighted averages show higher democratic clusters in urban areas along the Andean mountain ranges, and less so along the Caribbean coast. Weaker democratic clusters are visible in the rural areas and somewhat on the Pacific coast. So in yellow, that's weaker expected levels of democracy, and in blue, much higher. Just in terms of face validity, we took an example from the electoral mission in Colombia for 2018 and found there could be something to this. We still have a lot more steps to take for validity, but we see, for example, in the southern part of the country, higher levels of electoral violence being reported, and similarly lower levels of subnational democracy expected using our method. So in conclusion, subnational democracy has the potential to be measured using VDEM data and observational data. Results can be interpreted as expectations of subnational democracy. Some expert level ratings may be inaccurate, but if theoretical assumptions are true, this provides a first step using VDEM data for subnational analysis. Our analysis of Colombia is a proof of concept, so we're leveraging well-developed geographic data from DANE and other sources, and I think we've heard from many of our colleagues here that Colombia is a unique country with a lot of data and a lot of excellent subnational surveys and studies on democracy. Provisional results are based on limited subjective information, but also conditioned by levels of intercoder agreement. Just some basic next steps that we have in mind, but we would love some feedback at this stage. It's necessary to validate, obviously, the measure that we've reached. Comparisons with independent assessments of subnational democracy first. Also, the idea of online surveys of VDEM experts to code questions for departments or municipalities for selected years. And also time series analysis, which is something that we're currently undertaking, conditional on availability of historical data. And also to improve the internal validity, we've considered anchoring these ratings at the national level for Colombia to create ranges of variation. So for example, the Clean Elections Index could anchor subnational election scores. We've also considered using Bayesian analysis, given some excellent comments that we had in the comparative politics workshop here at Kellogg, to assess sort of the priors around the 22 subnational variables and the posterior expert ratings. And also to extend this method to other countries to see if we can replicate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. That was terrific and also terrific timing. You really stick to it. So I'm going to abuse my privileges to make some comments and raise some questions, and then we open to the audience. Thank you for these panelists for these great comments and presentations. I want to just emphasize three things that to me stood out of these presentations. And the first one, at the risk of alienating Michael by bringing up the issue that has brought you so much fatigue, I'm going to talk about the categorical versus continuous distinction. I think Michael made a very provocative statement here, right? He said that democracy is continuous not only because we can measure it more conveniently to avoid measurement error, but that as a concept, it is intrinsically continuous, right? That I think challenges the way we tend to think about democracy quite clearly, right? So the empirical implication of democracy being categorical is that we see regimes clustering across different institutional equilibria. We see change also in concert across several dimensions, but he has shown evidence that that's not the case. Actually, change operates along different dimensions, and countries don't cluster statically as we tend to think. So that's an empirically driven challenge of a very common conception we have. Secondly, I think we learned that the subnational area is the new frontier of research for subjective assessments of democracy. Both Brigitte and Patrick showed very promising methodologies for doing so. And I think that even though there are objective measures of subnational democracy that have been proliferating for the last 2 decades or so, we are able to learn about more fine-grained dimensions through these subjective indicators. At the same time, the third thing that to me stood out is that I really like this approach that Brigitte and her co-authors are bringing to this project, which is theory-driven methodology, right? So this kind of inverts. We tend to worry like academics, we're in this Babel tower, we don't pay attention, but actually sometimes we need theory to measure things well. I think that's a very interesting feature of this project. I want to make just a few comments that somehow overlap with these observations that I made. I think that in general, I'm thinking now the premise of this conference, which is how to be effectively public-facing, how to be policy relevant. When we do social science research, we face a dilemma, right? We of course want to be relevant, we of course want to relate, but also we don't want to fall for a version of common sense which is poorly understood and unhelpful, right? We want to dumb down what we do in a way that actually is washed out of any meaning. We want to if things have to be measured in a complex fashion, you can you have to reflect that. We don't ask, if we want to measure inflation, we respect what economists tell us about how to measure inflation, most of the time at least, right? Nobody would, rely on people to measure inflation. We run surveys of measures of prices and we look at change. I think that as political scientists, we also have that prerogative. But I think there are some dilemmas here, right? So the first one follows from this idea of democracy being intrinsically continuous and also political regimes more general, right? People don't think of democracy in a continuous fashion, right? And I would confess I don't either, right? I think of democracy categorically, right? I struggle when I see papers that make comments about continuous measures of democracy. So the question is, how do we then convey our results? How do we tell people that on the ground field democracy is categorically failing, that our measures say something different? Should we find ways of explaining this? Should we tweak our measures so that are more relatable? I'm not sure, but this is, I'm sure, something that you face. I also have a question about the distinction between objective and subjective indicators. I think that the analysis that Michael and Brigitte and co-authors did in these PSPs put a lot of the bad vibes bias critique to rest. I'm very convinced by that. It's a very impressive and convincing analysis. But I think there is another way in which subjectivity raises problems, which has to do, again, with how people perceive democracy. Just for some self-promotion with my friend Scott Mainwaring, we're writing a paper where we investigate what drives support for democracy in Latin America. And what we find, and this echoes some of recent research by other people, Seim backsliding, and also some of the recent questions that LAPOP has included, is that actually people don't disagree with experts so much on what democracy means. People tend to actually value freedom. They tend to value elections. They tend to value checks and balances. But what they disagree with is whether that happens on the ground, right? An expert could tell them, hey, you have a democracy. Tell them, no, I don't, right? Because I don't see my freedoms happening on the ground. So how do we tackle that subjective gap that has to do with whether something operates really, in practice rather than on conceptions about democracy? I'm wondering, could BDEM actually include surveys of people to try to integrate that into whether democracy actually operates on the ground or not? And I think that's it. I will open the room for questions. First, students, if students want to ask questions, if not, anyone else? Yes, in the back.
Hi, thanks for that presentation. I have a question for Brigitte because, so I work at Freedom House. I run the learning agenda on Freedom House's LWA, which is the sort of the counterpart to SEPS. We do the human rights aspect, the HRSM. And I'm just curious, number one, how much is this going to cost? Are you paying the experts? I'm really fascinated by that. Number two, how are you deconflicting this idea that, quarter to quarter, there's actually a lot of things that USAID is funding in, say, Armenia or Benin that may or may not be included in SEPS. Like, for instance, I know we're supporting CSOs to engage in, increased participation of women in a lot of those countries. So, and then if I could ask a final question, I think just generally, for all three of the panelists, I think there's a really big push now in the practitioner world to sort of set definitions of democracy from a local perspective, and I'm just curious a little bit to get to Lisa's question, how you're thinking about that in your work.
Okay. Is this on? Yes, okay. Yeah, so thank you, Luis, for your comments and for your question. So quick answers to your few kind of technical nitty-gritty questions. Yes, we are compensating the respondents. We're distinguishing between partner respondents that are going to be filling out the program's questionnaire and then also providing some input on the substantive surveys from external respondents, which are the experts we're recruiting that are not part of SEPS programs, SEPS partners. So those are the individuals that will be compensated. We can't, for obvious reasons, compensate the SEPS partners in the field. This is with some pushback. They're part of their kind of MEL work stream. Yes, you are absolutely right. That especially since we did end up working in a lot of places with a lot of different programming, that there's going to be other actors involved. We are hopefully going to capture that by having a battery of questions on the program survey that asks about other predominant actors in the area, and then if someone enters an actor, and then they have a kind of drop-down menu to then indicate which area they're working in, and then some more follow-up questions that are just Likert scale questions about kind of the type and intensity of work. Similarly, we're also hopefully capturing competing programs. We really need better names for all of these things. But anyway, competing programs just within the SEPS organizations that are maybe going to indirectly affect the same outcomes, but aren't going to be captured by the specific questions about these areas of programming that we have. So we have a set of questions, analogous ones on those. And then, yes, so just briefly on kind of some of these broader points. Yes, the democratization of democracy definitions. This is very important, and I hope this is where kind of our inclusion of maybe not everyday citizens, but of more practitioners and more individuals who are living democracy on the ground will assist with this problem. Will give a different perspective. And then similarly, our questions, which, I don't think any of them use the word democracy, or even any of the more adjacent technical terms like freedom of information. They're very specifically like, do women, are women registered to vote? Do you know of women CSOs in your area? I'm hoping that will address some of that as well.
I'll say a couple of things, if I may. For Luis, I think it's a really good question. How do you convey results about democracy if you think about it and measure it in a continuous way? Our common everyday language for talking about democracy is in terms of regime types. Is this a democracy? Is it a totalitarian regime? Is it authoritarian? Is it, whatever label you want to slap on it? And if you just tell people this is a 0.65, that's not the kind of thing that you would ordinarily do in casual conversation. Well, yes, I would, but I think the best way to do it, which is not in casual conversation, but in popular press articles and things like that, or presentations, is visually with charts and graphs. You can draw lines and put dots on things and put it on a scale, and that's meaningful to most people. But I would say that there's an area of life in which we customarily talk about numbers to each other, and we find them meaningful because we've done it so often, and that's talking about temperatures. You can say it's 72 degrees out, and everybody knows what you mean, as long as you know whether it's Fahrenheit or Celsius. We've done that so often that we know what those numbers mean, and we can imagine what it feels like to be 72 degrees out. And I think, among communities of political scientists or scholars or people who work on democracy professionally, I think we could talk just in terms of numbers, and by constant use, we could find that meaningful. How do you tackle the gap between popular and expert perceptions of democracy? Go with the expert perceptions, because respondents in surveys, the man on the street or woman, they're not political scientists. They have no comparative perspective. You can't expect them to, their perceptions to be very meaningful for making any kinds of comparisons. And that kind of feeds into the question about using local definitions of democracy. I think as long as the measure of democracy or the classification of a democracy is only going to be used within that country, that would be fine, and maybe that would even be better. You could talk about that, like if we're doing this in the United States, we could include the Electoral College. But if this is information that's going to be used for making comparisons to other countries, it's absolutely essential to have standard concepts and measures that can travel from place to place.
Mayra, you had a question, right?
Yes. Thank you. All presentations were super interesting, and I wanted to ask Brigitte is a similar question that to the one that was asked before, but I was wondering, how would you isolate the interventions and the impact of the interventions, not only from like other programs, but thinking that like probably the programs have very ambitious goals, like, I don't know, like women participation or something like that. How do you isolate from other things that are going on like within the countries, or how do you think that you could do that for the project?
You want to follow up on that, Jamie? Yes, two finger.
No, I just had another question for Brigitte related to the measurement. Jamie Black in political science. I was just curious if you're capturing, I couldn't because the font was small, and I apologize if I missed it, but are you also asking them about things that would indicate the negative pole? So things that would indicate not change or like worse outcomes, or, and then I also wanted to ask if you're using any open-ended questions.
Sorry, what was the last part?
Any open-ended questions? Like
yeah.
if you're trying to.
Yeah. Yes. So the answer to the first question is we won't be able to isolate it well. This is undoubtedly going to be a bundled treatment, if we can think about it kind of in that language, of a bunch of different programs kind of happening at once. You can think of what we would ideally see, right, when we do the analysis, which is there's a point in time where all of a sudden they support the electoral management body, and then, you know, maybe 2 quarters later, people have more trust in the EMB. That's not what we're going to show. We know that. It's going to be much more complicated with a lot of other things happening, and like it will be very difficult to isolate it. Again, we are not planning to say something causal, and I, in a lot of my work with USAID, kind of recoil against putting a stake in the ground in that way. So I don't anticipate we'll do that in this project, but you know, we would like to say we seem to be seeing improvements in this variable after this huge bundle of things happened. Maybe that's something to explore kind of statements. Jamie, amazing. I'm not sure I've ever actually met you. Hi. Lots of panels together over the years. Yeah, so yes, we are doing some open-ended questions. And then our approach, in answer to your first question, our approach generally is to just ask the same exact question every quarter. And unlike VDEM, which gives people their previous answers as they fill out the VDEM survey, we are having people do it kind of blind to their last answers. Hopefully, you know, we're not asking them to forget their previous answers. We're just hoping that they kind of fill out the survey afresh each quarter. And then, you know, if there are declines, that'll be captured just in, they'll select worse items on the Likert scale, if that makes sense. So, and again, we're using a measurement model to kind of aggregate across the experts. We're using anchoring vignettes and a lot of the other approaches we use in VDEM to try to smooth across differences in experts and differences across contexts. So hope that we can capture all of that. He's had his hand up for a long time.
Yes.
Okay,
She has the
I'm
mic.
not sure who's next.
Yeah.
It's another question for you, sorry. But, so you have paid and unpaid experts. Do not all of these experts have some kind of financial incentive to say that this programming is working in this country? So how do you correct for that?
Yeah.
Sorry, since the mic's next to me, I'm good. Also, is there a way to find out if the program is not working, if there's an actual correlation to, let's say, corruption, because funding from aid organizations is fueling programming that actually, you know, goes against democratic principles. And I would just, for what it's worth, imagine that without being able to come as close as possible to giving a thumbs up or thumbs down. I know causation is maybe really, you know, maybe a bridge too far. But without coming as close as possible, what is the point? If ultimately all of this incredible work doesn't actually shift programming, then what would be your most hopeful outcome or purpose of this incredible project?
Yeah. So we are, Yes, so in answer to the question about the bias in experts, I'm very worried about this. We've had a series of training sessions for this kind of decentralized network that's recruiting the respondents to try to say, like, we want people that aren't attached to the program, that aren't motivated, to say certain things about the program. You know, the idea with respondent compensation in any survey is that it's independent of their answers, right? So hopefully that won't be any different for this survey. But yeah, I mean, I'm very worried that these are individuals who are either kind of indirectly benefiting from the program because they're in this country and they're working in these areas, or these are individuals who are directly benefiting from the program because they started it and it's where they're employed. And, you know, we've just done what we can, but maybe there will be another huge debate over how biased our experts were. I can write another piece for PS. Once again, defending myself as not having wasted my career. It'll be fun. So yeah, I'm very worried. If you have bright ideas about kind of how to go about that, I'd love to hear them. But like today, because we're recruiting starting tomorrow. Yes, so we're doing actually two things to try to capture bad outcomes. So one thing is we're asking, one of the open-ended questions we're asking is kind of, what are the background conditions in this country that are improving? What are the background conditions in this country that are declining? So we can just see, like, kind of what are the modal responses? Are those patterns and modal responses something that is co-varying with the programming that we're seeing? The second thing that we're doing is that we will, of course, combine kind of the programmatic data with just analysis of the VDEM data and other data sources that have, you know, indicators of corruption, of, you know, human rights violations, some of the other things that we think might matter that we just couldn't ask about in our surveys because we just couldn't. So yeah, hopefully we will have an understanding. Did you have a second part of your question?
Just if you're gonna make recommendations.
Oh, yeah. So I think that, you know, what I would hope to come out of this is kind of what I said in response to Jamie's comment, like something along the lines of, or actually I think it was your comment, something along the lines of, you know, we see some promising shifts after this kind of programming, or we don't see any shifts after this programming, or we see problematic shifts after this programming. And, you know, that is something to explore and to think about as you customize your, you know, future programming. I think that's maybe what I would hope for. And then I would love to be in the room as they kind of explore our open-ended qualitative data and think through what that might actually look like in practice. But they might really hate me after this, so I probably won't be in the room.
I think we have a question from the online audience.
Yes, here's a virtual question from recent Kellogg visiting fellow Javier Perez Sandoval at the University of Oxford. He first thanks everyone for presentations, and he secondly says that it's amazing that you're pushing the boundaries and the quality of measures of democracy at the subnational level. And then has a question for Patrick or Michael. He says, if I'm understanding correctly, you use third-party socioeconomic data to weight and assign a spatial unit to VDEM scores. I am sure you have tried, but I'm curious if A, results change if you modify the spatial unit of analysis, i.e. whether you scale up or scale down, and B, I'm also curious if this could be used for inference, given that some interesting socioeconomic variables are baked into the measure of democracy itself.
I mean, we have discussed using department level data. Actually, Javier's paper was really an inspiration for us, and I should say that, Javier, thank you. But department level, I mean, we collected municipal level data. I think it was arbitrary in a sense, but also why not? And we collected municipal level data, and we can always aggregate it. We can find also department level data and scale it. I don't know, Michael, if you have any.
A couple of other comments. I think our first priority for attempting to validate the data is comparing it to Javier's department level data for Columbia. So we're really grateful that that's there, because otherwise we might not have anything to validate it against. But like based on what we've got so far, we find, like our data suggests, or estimates suggest that there is a lot of variation within departments across municipios in Colombia. So we'll see whether like the average level for municipios in each department will correlate with what Javier has found. That'll be interesting to see. And also I think Patrick is the one who wants to use the data for like trying to predict service delivery or health outcomes or things like that. And I've reason to be cautious about that, because if the same variable is used to create the factor scores that go into our measure, then they shouldn't also be used to be outcomes that we're trying to explain. So we have to maintain a separation there.
There was a question there, right? Or so? Oh, then. Yes.
Hi, Cecilia Leto, Open Society Foundations and former Notre Dame student, Kellogg graduate fellow, and VDM research associate. So I'm super interested, sorry, another one for you, Brigitte, about how long after the program has ended are they letting you still doing these measurements? Because on the practitioner side, we have a big problem convincing sort of the higher ups that, yes, we can convince them that we want to measure and evaluate these things as they're happening or shortly after the program has ended, but what we're really interested in is like long-term institutional strengthening and systemic change. And that obviously takes a longer time, and something that we've certainly observed as not just OSF, but a number of funders have gone through large internal restructures and pulled out of entire contexts is that if sort of grantee dependency is not addressed, then you have the entire collapse of like civil society ecosystems after the funder has left. So yeah, and I really want to talk to you more over dinner.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So this isn't a great solution, but what we're doing is we've first of all deliberately selected countries where there isn't any programming under this funding mechanism for one or all partners, but there was in the previous funding mechanism, which of course went by a different acronym. Don't worry, they would never reuse acronyms. And so hopefully we will be able to capture some of those long-term effects through that. Through just our sampling approach. But then we're also specifically asking about historical programming in a separate survey we'll be running that will basically be the same as the programming survey, but asking about the past 5 years. So I would welcome your thoughts about that survey, and we might need to make it more nuanced based on what you're saying now. But you know, it was kind of a survey we added at the last minute, and we did not have budget for it. So we'll have to see. But yeah, thank you.
There's a question here. Yes.
Thank you. Sylvia Pedraza, University of Michigan, sociology. I think it's a wonderful effort that you're all making, and very worthwhile and very difficult, as one can see. I wanted to say something about Patrick's paper, because it's about Colombia, and my family lived in Colombia for 12 years, so I have some knowledge of the country, which I think allowed me to look at your map and think about it. Otherwise, I couldn't have done it in such a brief amount of time. But I think that you said that you didn't want to call it a hypothesis, but your expectations were that the more urban, the more educated, the more, better democracy sort of outcomes. But when you looked at the map and when you told us what the results were, you were basically saying, if you look at the North Coast and if you look at the southeastern part of the country, those are the lowest levels of democratic outcomes. But when I think about that, I think that for sure those areas are not urban, but they're very different. I mean, the North Coast, and they're both very poor, I would say, that they have that in common. But the North Coast is, demographically speaking, is like the rest of the Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean, in fact. And the southern eastern folks are, in fact, very indigenous. And In the northeastern area, there has not been a history of violence in Colombia, but in the southeastern part of Colombia, I believe that there has been. So I think that your results are very interesting, but they're not about what your expectation or hypothesis was, I think. I don't know. Just reading a very quick map. Yeah.
I don't really know how to respond. I think the one thing I would say is indigenous and ethnic populations in our factor analysis are by far the most salient dimension in the data. So they explain a lot of variation. And Colombia's, a very diverse country.
But not a history of violence? That's not a...
Sorry?
Not a history of violence? I mean, that's not a variable that you're taking?
Well, it shows up on our factor analysis it shows up, we're studying just a cross-section of 2018.
Right.
Maybe if we expanded into panel, we would see a different result.
No, I don't think you have to change the year. What I'm referring to is that from the 1960s on, certain parts of Colombia were very much under la violencia, as it was called. But that actually was not true in the northeast, in the north coast area, but it was true in the southeast area. And so why doesn't that come up as an explanation, I guess?
I don't know. I don't know I think there was violence in the north, but I think that's subject to further research.
Okay.
Sorry.
I think Justin has a question there in the back.
So I was really impressed with the way that you guys are looking into subnational democracy. When I play around with the VDEM data, I mean, it's one of the things that I wish I would know more about is how these different countries operated within those countries. The question that I have is your vision of using subnational democracy, is it going to be that it will roll up into the overall picture of democracy within that country? Like, is that going to be the ultimate idea, or are these two entirely independent ways of thinking about democracy? Because on one way of thinking about it, I could imagine that the overall sense of democracy within Colombia should have some relationship to the individual municipalities that are kind of linked together. I'm not asking you to do it, but I mean, is that the goal to be able to do it, or is that something that's really not possible and not part of the vision behind it?
I'll take a stab at that. They're independent things, independent goals, and I think it's important to understand that the subnational ratings that Patrick presented are relative ratings, like it's saying, because they're based on questions about which regions of the country are more democratic, which regions are less democratic. But it doesn't say how much more democratic. I mean, they're saying some are much more democratic, some are a little more democratic, et cetera. They're right on that scale. But we don't think that like the least relatively democratic regions of Colombia, or for example, like North Korea or Saudi Arabia, they're going to be within some range, and we don't know yet how to establish what the bounds of that range are. There would be some score, some fraction to add or subtract from a national average for Colombia as a whole, but how to calibrate what the bounds of that range are. I mean, it would probably take some additional exercise, like asking people to say, how does Antioquia in 2018 compare to Bolivia or something? I don't know, but calibration is a difficult challenge.
I'm Evelyn Huber, and from Political Science, UNC Chapel Hill. On the same topic about subnational democracy, so if we are thinking about does it matter, or how much does it matter how democratic subnational units are, we clearly have to take into account the relative authority that they have, right? So if provinces, municipalities have relatively little authority, then we would be less worried about the lesser degree of democracy. Whereas if they have a lot of authority in terms of national politics by sending delegates and so on, and in terms of deciding their own levels of taxation, service provision, and so on and so forth, we would worry a lot more about it. So this is just for the future, kind of, if you are scaling it up to comparative across country, that's something you will want to think about.
Yeah, this is a kind of a narrow conception of democracy, if it's democracy at all. They're actually measures of how free and fair elections are at this level, and the degree, how strong or weak are protections for civil liberties. So that doesn't cover everything that's entailed in democracy. And I'm not sure we have to know how much power or authority the subnational units have to just look at elections and civil liberties.
If you compare how much it matters across countries, then obviously if you have less free elections in units that don't have much authority, you are less worried about it than if you have questionable elections in Argentine elections that have a lot to say in national politics.
I think we have run out of time. So thanks everyone for coming.